So we are going to go ahead and officially get started. My name is Sharday. I'm one of the librarians at SFCC. My colleague here is Heather. She'll be joining us today. Know that we will have me mostly presenting. Heather will be here as well, participating. The way we like to set up our workshop is if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and talk if you like, but also please feel free to use the chat box. Heather will be looking at the chat box the entire time. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them there. So I'm just going to start with the basics, the definition of what plagiarism is. And yes, I'm literally going to read this off the screen. So plagiarism is, let me do this real quick. Representing in written and oral expression the words, thoughts, or ideas of another person without appropriate citation or referencing, usually for the purpose of intentionally misrepresenting such words, thoughts, or ideas as our own. So when we're talking about plagiarism, I think it's really easy for us to start to understand that if you copy someone's word for word, you can't do that, that's cheating. But what you really need to take away from this concept of plagiarism is that it's using anybody's idea. So if you're summarizing, if you're paraphrasing, if you're using their idea in any way, and it's not your own, you need to give credit to that person. If not, then you're misrepresenting where that information or that thought came from. And basically that's the thought that we're going to come back to over and over again in this workshop. It's not just using somebody's words, it's using somebody's ideas. And I always like to tie this back into the idea of academic integrity. So I know when we're in school, we could be in school for a lot of different reasons, particularly college or university. One of the things you're here for, though, is to learn how to express and explore your own ideas, your own thoughts, do your own research, or learn a certain skill. And the hope is that you become a competent and critical thinker. So that means that you come up with your own ideas that you add to the conversation. So if you're doing something like giving a speech or writing a paper, the point isn't to represent other people's thoughts as your own. The idea is to come up with your own original thought, to contribute something new. So yes, you're quoting, but when you quote something or you use somebody else's work, it's in support of whatever new point you're trying to make, whatever new argument you're bringing to the table. So we'll come back to this later in a little bit more detail, because I feel that sometimes students think, well, if I have to cite everything that I'm quoting or someone else's idea in my paper, that's my entire paper. That doesn't look good. So this is where I'll note that we do have a workshop next week where we're going to talk about how to do your own writing and incorporating someone else's thought or quote into that writing. So you're giving your own thoughts, but you're also giving credit to the support you're using, the evidence, the quotes from other sources. But keep in mind, college is all about coming up with your own ideas and thoughts and then using sources to support that. Now, I have a question for you all. And it is very obvious. I actually have a poll for this one. So, have you ever plagiarized before? And I'm going to launch a poll here where you can say yes, no, or not sure. I also want you to keep in mind that for the most part, we don't know who you are. And there's no teacher here judging you. This is us just checking in. So I am asking you to literally answer this question in this poll. Have you ever plagiarized before? And then maybe we can have a little discussion about why it's so easy to do, because it is so easy to do.
And just a reminder, the polls are anonymous. Your name's not going to be associated with anything. It's completely anonymous.
Yeah, and this isn't going to be shared with your teachers or anything like that. For the most part, this is just a conversation. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, we're not trying to out anybody. Okay, it looks like we have 8 out of 11 responses, minus Heather and I. I think we're maybe missing one person. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share those results with you. So it looks like yes, we have 5 people who are like, yeah, I've plagiarized, and a couple people who aren't sure, which is totally a legitimate answer. I'm hoping by the end of this workshop, you'll know if you've plagiarized or not. Sometimes there's some confusion related to it. And one of the goals of this workshop is to make sure you know whether or not you're plagiarizing and not to do it. But why do you think it's so easy to plagiarize? I'm literally asking. If you want, you can put your response in the chat box. I'm just going to give you a moment. I have some theories. This is the interactive part. All right, while you're thinking about it, I will put it out there. If I was answering this poll, I would probably say, yes, I've definitely plagiarized. You can see Heather nodding her head as well. We've been college students before. There's a lot of factors that go into it. You don't have enough time. You think if you kind of change some words around, nobody will notice. You don't mean to do it intentionally. It's too hard to track down where the information came from originally. Like it's honestly a very easy thing to do. I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, we got some responses. Thank you guys for sharing. So it's easy to do because, you know, you find your research and it's exactly what you want to write about. So why not just use that? Because that's what you want to say. That's a great example. And it's really easy to do unintentionally, which I think is a very good point to make as well. And the last one, I think all 3 of your responses are awesome responses, you guys. It's hard to know how to cite correctly. So sometimes you might just be avoiding doing the citation part because it's a little too complicated to figure out how to do it to begin with. So I just want to let you guys know, yeah, it's really easy to do. And today we're going to let you know why you don't want to do it and hopefully give you resources to avoid plagiarizing, because it has some actual really serious consequences, no matter where you kind of end up in life. Now, here's some rationale for not plagiarizing. The first part is you're taking part in an academic conversation as a college student, which goes back to what I was saying before about being a critical thinker, being able to come up with your own ideas, adding something new to a conversation that's already going on. And what I mean by that is usually you're asked to write a paper, give a speech, do some sort of assignment where you have a thesis statement, and then you have to support that statement, right? Well, the idea is that you're coming up with your own original thought. So whatever you use to support it is what you think, not what someone else has to say. You're only using that evidence as authority for what statement you are making, for what your thesis statement is. It also helps readers locate where you got your sources from. I'll steal a page out of Heather's book here. Like, it shows that you did the work. Like, you did the effort of doing the research. Make note of where you got it from so your instructors know that, like, you put in the time and effort. And the last part that I think is really critical is it is unethical, and according to our school guidelines, it is considered academic dishonesty and cheating, and there can be some very serious consequences for that. So let's talk about what those consequences might be. So there is a student code of conduct we have at SFCC. I'm going to click right here. It's going to bring me to a page that will tell me a little bit more about the school's code of conduct. I can't imagine you've had like a lot of reason to come and look at this, but just so you know, it does exist. And right here, we have a section on academic dishonesty. Plagiarism is considered a part of that academic dishonesty, and there can be a number of consequences related to plagiarizing. Here's a list of how we define plagiarism, academic dishonesty, and its violations. Just so you know, if you want to go through this, you'll have access to this PowerPoint later. So it might be something you want to take a serious look at. But something I would also note is that this is an expectation of every college, of every university, of most places where you're going to work. The expectation is that ethically you're going to be an honest person. So if you plagiarize, let's say at SFCC, you can be referred to the Student Code of Conduct Board, and they might come up with a specialized plan on how they're going to address the facts that you've plagiarized. I think a lot of times students think if they say I did it unintentionally, there aren't consequences for that. And that is not true, because this is an expectation of academia in general and in a lot of work environments. So if you find that you have plagiarized, if you've plagiarized more than once, especially, the consequences become more severe. If you're at a university, there's a very real possibility you will be asked to leave that university or college. So know that this is something that the schools, all schools, take very seriously. So now that we kind of get the scary part over, let's talk about the different types so you can identify what plagiarism is and then steer clear of it. So I had mentioned earlier that there's unintentional and intentional plagiarism. So let's take a moment to talk about intentional plagiarism. And some of these are going to be very familiar for you. You'll also note that in the little corner here, I have a star that says assessment. So at the end, when you're asked to fill out those assessment questions, hint, hint, wink, wink, the following perhaps is one of those questions. Not here to trick you. So the first version of intentional copy or of plagiarism is direct copying. And I think this is something that comes up a lot and people can easily identify. You copy and paste something from another text and represent it directly as your own. You don't acknowledge where it comes from. Obviously, that's a big no-no. You go online and hire someone to write your paper for you and you represent it as your own work. Big, big, big no-no. Then the next two get a little bit more complicated, and I think this becomes a little bit of the gray area. So we have patchwork. Now, patchwork plagiarism, I would say, is the one as a student I had a hard time like really grasping. And if ever I did plagiarize as a student, it was probably in this way, and you need to steer clear of it. So this is where you kind of have multiple sources. You maybe pull an idea from one source, another from another source, and then you change it and put it into your own words, and then you represent it as your own writing. Now, the problem here is that you're using other people's ideas. So again, emphasizing the fact that plagiarism isn't using other people's words exactly, it's using other people's ideas and representing them as your own. And that goes along with this concept of paraphrasing. So we see this a lot as well. Perhaps there is something from a book, an article, something you found online that you feel like exactly says what you wanted to say. And so you summarize it, you put it in your own words, you don't cite it, you just use it as part of your paper as if you had written it. Again, you're using somebody else's idea. And so that is plagiarism. And that is something that, even if it's intentional or not intentional, is not acceptable when it comes to plagiarizing. I'm going to pause. Heather, is there anything you want to add? I just want to make sure I'm checking in with you.
No, I think we're good. And I'm not seeing anything in the chat window. Just a reminder, you're welcome to put your questions into the chat window, and either I'll answer them in chat or I will share them with Sade so we can address them across the board.
Yeah, so feel free to ask questions at any time. Okay, now we get to this concept of unintentional plagiarism. And it sounds a little harsh, but this is something more or less that in academia and in most careers where like ethically you have to be very truthful and give credit, just generally in life, we just have to draw a hard line. I think a lot of times students think if you say, well, I didn't intend to plagiarize, so that's okay, right? It's not. I'm sorry to say it's not. At that point, usually the initial interaction will be with like your instructor, who will let the like code of conduct board or whoever's in charge of kind of that making sure that if you've plagiarized, you understand what that is and what the consequences are. Saying I didn't mean to or I didn't know I was doing it is not a very acceptable answer, sadly. So in the end, even if it's unintentional, there will be consequences in some way. And that might be talking to a librarian like us to be very clear what plagiarism is, but it could also escalate from there. If you've plagiarized a number of times and you keep saying, well, I didn't know, or it was unintentional, that is not going to be an acceptable answer. So even if you didn't mean to do it, we just kind of have to draw the line and say, if you've plagiarized, you've plagiarized, and now we have to take some steps forward to determine how we're going to address it. And again, I'm not trying to scare you, but I do want to convey the seriousness of the situation. And of course, we don't want to leave you without resources. So if you're ever not sure, check with tutoring, check with your instructor, check with a librarian. We are all here to help you. So if you ever feel like you're in a position where you're not sure, I would say those are the three main places where we are happy to help you make that determination and give you resources for not plagiarizing. Oh, here, I didn't even do that on purpose. Like, I made these slides, but I don't have them memorized. So how to avoid plagiarism is our next section. And in the end, you just want to be honest. Whenever you've used another source, another person's idea, you want to include a citation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a workshop about making citations, but I do want to explain the basic format for you so you have the tools not to plagiarize. Now, probably many of you have had to cite something or create a works cited page or a reference page. And that can be based off of the different styles that you're being asked to use for your class. So you might be asked to use something like MLA, APA. We don't see Chicago as much at our school, but some subject areas use Chicago. What you're asked to use is mostly based off of what department or subject area you're in. So MLA tends to be used more by the English department, humanities. It's basically how those academics have decided they want to represent how you give credit, how things are formatted. APA tends to be used more by like the social sciences. So you'll see it a lot in like psychology, sociology, that type of subject area. And then Chicago, like for me, I was a big history person in school. So we mostly used Chicago, which I didn't realize at the time was not the norm for a lot of people, but for the most part, while you are at SFCC, you will probably use MLA the most and then a little bit of APA. It's important to know the difference between these because they ask you to format differently what you're citing. So the idea here is if you've summarized someone else's words, if you've done a direct quote, there's a certain way that you format where you got that information from. So we call this an in-text citation. So it's a little tag that goes somewhere within your writing that lets us know where you got this information. Now, the idea behind the citation is that, let's say this is the paper that you've written. Here's an example of what an in-text citation might look like. So here we can see that this part of my writing has an idea or a thought that has come from another person. And I'm putting the author's last name and the page number from which I got that information. This directly correlates to my end page of my essay, my paper, what have you, so that I can take that last name, look it up on the works cited page, and it gives me the full information of where I got it. So it's going to tell me the title of the website, the name of the article, what page it came from in the book. And then this way I'm giving full acknowledgement of where that information came from. So when in doubt, I say cite. And I think Heather would agree. For the most part, if you're not sure, create that citation. Now I want to acknowledge that because there are different formats, as I mentioned, there's MLA and APA, it's going to ask you to create those different citations in different ways. So for MLA, they usually ask that you use the author's last name and the page number. And in APA, it's the same, but sometimes they're going to ask you to include the year as well. So this looks different for whatever format that you're using. So I just want to show you an example of what this could look like in your paper. So in this instance here, we have some examples from APA. And here we have a sentence or an idea that we've taken from another person. Here I've noted the name of the author, the year of the publication of where it came out, when it came out, and the page number. So this would be a good example of something that I had gotten from a book. Most of these are book examples, but we will be providing a link at the end of the workshop, or Heather can do it now if Heather has time, that will take you to our citation guide. And we also have a link very specifically for this presentation as well. And it will give you the resources you need to learn how to make citations and how to do these in-text citations. But I just wanted to give you a visual of what this might look like. I see that there's some conversations going on in the chat. Should just checking in. Yes, I love it. When in doubt, cite.
That's mostly me just reiterating some things in the chat.
And there's certainly things that you might know about citations. Some things, like, it gets really specific. Like if you're getting a citation from like a news article online, then that's going to be a different citation than getting a news article in a database. So the way you format it is very specific. And that's where librarians come in. So if you have questions, we totally will help you make your citations. We are happy to do that. That is 100% a part of our job. Now, there are a few instances when you do not need to cite. Now, when you're discussing your own experience, observations, reactions, going back to that idea of writing a paper or giving a speech, the point that you are trying to make, you don't have to give a citation for that, right? The hope is that you have some sort of original idea or research topic assigned to you from class, and you're presenting it as your thoughts. You don't need to cite your own thoughts if it's specifically for that paper and that assignment in that way. Now, this applies differently to different subject areas. So let's say you are a scientist and you're doing experiments in biology, chemistry, you're an anthropologist gathering data. The actual data itself from an experiment or statistics or numbers that you find, that's your own information that you compiled as a researcher. You don't need to cite where that came from because you made it. So if you are in some sort of degree, as I mentioned, like the sciences, your original research doesn't need to be cited because you're the one who came up with that information. If someone else used that in their paper, they would have to cite you. And then the very last example we have here, I think, is the one that can get a little confusing. And this is using common knowledge. Now, what is common knowledge? Also a hint, this might also be on the assessment portion of the eval. So common knowledge is anything that is easily observable, or for the most part, I would really stick with the concept that it is a fact. So grass is green. We consider that to be a fact. If we start to analyze or give an explanation as to why grass is green, now we started a different conversation where we need source material to support that statement. Common facts. So the US entered World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That is a fact. That statement in and of itself does not need to be cited. But if you start to analyze how that happened, give a historical review of how that happened, then you need sources to support it and you need to cite it. Common sayings also count as common knowledge. So absence makes the heart grow fonder. You do not necessarily need to quote that. However, if you are quoting something from like a speech or something that someone said, you definitely need to quote that. But common sayings, you don't. And this is where I think it gets a little confusing. So if you have questions, check in with your librarian, your instructor, tutoring. We can help you determine if it falls under that common knowledge umbrella or not. Also, if you're just not sure, cite it and no one's going to be upset about that. Although I will admit that like quotes are notoriously hard to research to figure out who said what. So even for librarians, it can be really difficult to find where a quote came from.
And something else, as you're about to go into some other examples, something to keep in mind is something that you may think is common knowledge. Think of who your audience is, because what's common knowledge for you may not be common knowledge for your audience. Oh, so look, see, there you go. You have it right there at the bottom. It's like I already,
You're on it, Heather. I love it.
I had that. The other thing to also mention in terms of what's common knowledge for you, I know sometimes I've worked with students who said, well, do I have to cite that because like I already knew that, and just because you already know something doesn't mean that you don't cite it. So I just wanted to add that.
That's a really good example too. If you're familiar with the topic, you still need to cite where the information comes from. If you're adding a thought or a new idea to it, right? That's you writing your paper, giving your speech, coming up with some information, that's different. Other examples of common knowledge, just so you have a good understanding of it. There are 4 seasons in a year. There are 365 days in a year. No one expects you to go find a source that states there's 365 days in a year. We more or less consider that a fact. So if you are ever questioning, kind of refer back to these examples and it might help you make that determination. And as Heather mentioned before, common knowledge in one culture can be very different in another culture. So going back to that concept, if you're not sure, go ahead and create a citation and you should be in the clear. No one's going to be upset about that. This is a page where we have created more or less, what do you call this? Like a tree that will help you figure out if you're plagiarizing or not. So if ever you come to a moment and you think, am I plagiarizing? I'm not sure. This is going to be on one of our guides. Heather, could you put the avoiding plagiarism link in the chat box?
Yep.
So you will find this on our avoiding plagiarism library guide. Heather is providing the link at this moment, but it asks you a series of questions to determine if you're plagiarizing or not. So, did you work on a class assignment with a friend? No? Great. Are you using your own words to describe what it is you're doing? Yes. Is it your own idea? Great. You're not plagiarizing. Are you paraphrasing and using someone else's other words, but not citing where that information comes from? Ooh, not so good. You're plagiarizing. Or let's say you are working with a friend. What are the circumstances under which you are working with them? Again, I would go back to that main idea of if you are not being assigned in a team group, then you are expected to complete that work individually on your own. And if you are working together or using your friend's words, and this includes in the same class from another class, if you've gone online and found past students' work for the class that you're in and you copy that or use their information, that is for sure academic dishonesty and plagiarism and is not going to be responded to kindly by your instructors. So use this little chart to help you kind of determine where you are in that process is my recommendation. And I have this last slide here about what other kinds of academic dishonesty there are. And what I mean by that is kind of what I referenced earlier. I know that we live in a digital age and the way we conceive of things now can be very different. Even referring to that conversation we had before the workshop when Heather and I were talking about like copyright and music, and we definitely live in a world where we share a lot of things and build upon a lot of things, writing, music, images, but the honest truth is that there are still consequences for these things, and especially in an academic realm and in different careers you might enter into, dishonesty in general, not acceptable. So let's say, like I said, you were in the sciences and you used someone else's data and didn't give credit for it. That's plagiarism and academic dishonesty. Let's say you found a past student's work online for a class that you're currently taking, and you use their answers or you use part of their work in your work in the hopes that your instructor isn't going to notice. That is plagiarism and academic dishonesty. So if you pretty much are using anybody's idea, thought, information, and it has not come from you and you are not crediting where it is coming from, then you have kind of passed that line into academic dishonesty and plagiarism. And that's where there will be potential consequences, And also, just to be honest with you guys, I know you're super busy and you have a lot on your plate, but you're kind of bypassing the point of college at that point. Our hope is that you become critical thinkers and learn how to pull these resources together to support your own thoughts and make your own arguments and be a well-rounded, educated person. And again, I know that takes a lot of time and effort. I understand. But at the very least, just so you know, that is the goal.
Perhaps we already mentioned this, but I always like to reiterate this. I think a lot of times when we think about plagiarism, we're thinking about the written word, that we're actually writing an essay. But plagiarism also exists if you're giving a speech. There are ways that you can give credit while you're actually providing your speech. That's also if you're doing like a PowerPoint presentation. For instance, right now in Sade, I don't know if I'm calling you out on this, but Sade has used an image right here, right, of this woman using a laptop. So
wait, can I say thank you so much for calling me out on that? So I very specifically went to a website where you're allowed to use images without giving credit for it. So I didn't just pull this off of Google. I went to a special image like database where you can use images for free and you don't have to give credit. But you wouldn't know that by looking at that. So good example, Heather. Thank you.
Exactly. And that's actually a great thing to point out, because a lot of times Creative Commons. And but that is something to be aware of, because there are times when what you need to illustrate in your PowerPoint or in your presentation isn't considered Creative Commons. And so that's not necessarily that you can't do it. You just still need to acknowledge it and, cite it. So I just want to remind people that it also includes images if you're using music, anything like that.
So please fill out that eval form. At this part, the workshop is done. You are free to go about your day, and we thank you for your attendance.